At some point, many of us learn to carry our lives like a courtroom case. We gather evidence, rehearse explanations, polish our pain into something acceptable, and wait for the moment someone questions us. When they do, we're ready. We defend our choices, our mistakes, our past, our boundaries, our healing. We defend why we stayed too long, why we left too early, why we changed, why we didn't. We defend our story as if it's on trial. But here's the truth no one tells you clearly enough: your life was never meant to be defended. The habit of defending your story often begins quietly. Maybe it started when someone dismissed your feelings and you learned to over-explain so you'd be believed. Maybe it began when your dreams didn't fit the expectations placed on you, so you learned to justify them. Maybe it came from survival, when explaining yourself felt safer than standing firm. Over time, that habit turns into an identity. You stop living freely and start living carefully, always prepared to explain why you are the way you are. Defending your story can look responsible on the surface. It can sound mature, thoughtful, self-aware. But underneath, it's often rooted in something far heavier: the fear of being misunderstood, rejected, or judged. When you constantly defend yourself, you're silently asking for permission to exist as you are. And permission was never required. When you defend your story, you give other people authority they never earned. You allow their opinions to become the measuring stick of your worth. You shrink your truth into something palatable, something less threatening, something easier for others to digest. You edit yourself. You soften your edges. You trade authenticity for acceptance. The exhausting part is that no defense is ever enough. The moment you explain one chapter of your life, someone will question another. If you justify your pain, they'll minimize it. If you justify your growth, they'll accuse you of changing. If you justify your boundaries, they'll call you cold or difficult. There is no finish line where everyone nods and agrees that your life finally makes sense. That's because your life was never meant to make sense to everyone. Not everyone has the context of your experiences. Not everyone has walked through your losses, your silence, your survival. Not everyone understands the nights you endured or the choices you made when all options were painful. Expecting universal understanding is a setup for constant disappointment. You will always feel like you're failing an invisible test. When you stop defending your story, something radical happens: you reclaim your energy. Think about how much emotional labor goes into explaining yourself. Replaying conversations in your head. Anticipating criticism. Preparing responses. Carrying guilt for choices that were necessary for your well-being. All that energy could be redirected into living, creating, healing, and growing. You don't owe anyone a neatly packaged explanation of your life. Your story doesn't need to be impressive to be valid. It doesn't need to sound strong to prove you survived. It doesn't need to be tragic to justify your healing. It doesn't need to be logical to be true. It only needs to be yours. Stopping the defense doesn't mean becoming cruel or dismissive. It doesn't mean you stop communicating altogether. It means you stop negotiating your worth. It means recognizing the difference between sharing and justifying. Sharing comes from openness. Justifying comes from fear. Sharing says, "This is my truth." Justifying says, "Please approve of my truth." Approval is a fragile foundation to build a life on. There will be people who misunderstand you even when you speak clearly. There will be people who project their own wounds onto your choices. There will be people who feel threatened by your growth because it forces them to confront their stagnation. None of that is your responsibility to fix. When you stop defending your story, you also stop inviting unnecessary opinions. Not everyone deserves access to your inner world. Not everyone is qualified to comment on your healing. Some people don't want to understand you, they want to control the narrative so they can feel comfortable. You are allowed to outgrow versions of yourself without explaining every step of the transformation. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to set boundaries without providing a PowerPoint presentation of your trauma. You are allowed to say, "This no longer works for me," and let that be enough. One of the hardest truths to accept is that some people prefer the version of you that was easier to manipulate, easier to predict, easier to benefit from. When you stop defending your story, those people may get louder. They may accuse you of being selfish, dramatic, or ungrateful. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It often means you're finally doing something right. Growth looks like betrayal to people who relied on your silence. There's a quiet confidence that emerges when you stop explaining yourself. It's not arrogance. It's groundedness. It's the calm of knowing that your truth doesn't require validation to exist. You stop arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop trying to be clear enough for those who benefit from confusion. Instead, you start asking better questions. Do I feel aligned with my values? Am I being honest with myself? Does this choice support the life I'm trying to build? Those questions matter far more than public approval. Defending your story also keeps you stuck in the past. Every explanation drags you back into moments you're trying to move beyond. Healing doesn't always require retelling the wound. Sometimes it requires closing the book and writing something new. You don't owe the world constant access to your scars. You can honor your past without living inside it. When you stop defending your story, you make room for peace. Peace doesn't come from being understood by everyone, it comes from understanding yourself. It comes from trusting your own judgment. It comes from standing by your decisions even when they're unpopular. This doesn't mean you'll never explain yourself again. It means you'll do it by choice, not compulsion. You'll speak when it feels safe, when it feels purposeful, when it feels mutual. You'll stop bleeding in rooms that only want entertainment. Your story is not a debate topic. It's a lived experience. Let people think what they want. Let them misunderstand. Let them create narratives that have nothing to do with you. Their version of your life is not your responsibility to manage. The people who truly care will ask, listen, and hold space, not demand justification. There is freedom in realizing that you don't need to convince anyone that your pain was real, your growth was necessary, or your boundaries are valid. Those truths stand on their own. Stop defending your story and start living it. Speak your truth without footnotes. Set boundaries without apologies. Move forward without dragging everyone with you. Your life is not on trial. You are not guilty for becoming yourself. And you never needed a defense in the first place.